Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. Today I'm talking about the 1932 PreCode horror slash, well, it's not really a horror film, although it's sold that way usually, but it's really a murder mystery entitled The Death Kiss, which is most notable for reteaming the three major leads from Universal's 1931 classic adaptation of Dracula. So this film reteams Edward Van Sloan, David Manners, and the immortal Bela Lugosi in a murder mystery set at a film studio during the production of a PreCode thriller. But this actually was shot and takes place in a real-life studio. The studio was named Tiffany Studios, and this was made by not a major studio, so it has fallen into the public domain, which means the only times you see it, it turns up in really deplorable shape and all of the usual gray market and public domain cheapy transfers. It's turned up in countless Lugosi box sets or public domain releases or Lugosi Karloff releases, like a lot of their non-major studio releases, like all of Lugosi's Monogram films, for example. But this one is a bit of an outlier because you have the three leads of Dracula coming back and together in the same film, but it's really a fun murder mystery set amidst Hollywood, and the fact that they actually shot it in a real studio, it gives it a nice verisimilitude. And so I think this is a must for all murder mystery fans, all PreCode fans, fans of Universal's Dracula, of course, and the lead three performers, but also fans of films that depict the filmmaking process, because the fact that they actually shot this in a real-life studio at the time, it gives you that sort of nice you are there feeling. And all the fact that it's not a big studio film, it feels a bit looser, and they're literally there. There's no sets or backdrops or anything, so you really see a studio at the time, not a major studio, but one of the smaller studios, what it was like at that time in the PreCode era of early sound days. And that alone really makes this a worthwhile watch. But of course, this is highlighted by the three Dracula stars returning. Edward Van Sloan plays the film's director, and the film literally opens with actually quite a nice setup that becomes rather obvious where this is going pretty quickly. But the lead actor of the film is supposed to be shot on screen, but of course, someone has substituted live ammunition, although that in today's world is unfortunately a bit prescient with things that have happened since then. But it's a nice setup, well executed, and it gets you into the main thrust of the plot very quickly. And then the police show up, and then it becomes a matter of trying to decipher who exactly is the would-be perpetrator, what their motives are, and pretty much everyone in the entire facility is a suspect. Lugosi plays the sort of studio manager of the whole studio, and as soon as he appears, it's also quite striking to see Lugosi this early on playing a non-horror role, and he doesn't have any problems with his accent. So the whole notion of him having to learn his lines phonetically for Universal's Dracula, that's an urban legend. He has no trouble whatsoever really selling himself in this part of a studio manager. And David Manners, you would think, is yet another of his juvenile leads that he was sort of typecast as in Dracula, which we all love him in those types of roles, but he was not really, he never had the greatest opinion of his film roles, and sort of had an inherent cynicism about always being typecast as the juvenile lead and being at least somewhat ineffectual. Well, David Manners fans rejoice, because this film, in which he plays a screenwriter and, of course, the person who decides to become amateur sleuth throughout the entire story, this is the most breezy, fun, witty, whimsical David Manners performance I think there is. It's really a star vehicle for him. It is his picture. It gets sold as a Lugosi vehicle, because he had the biggest name value. But Lugosi's only in the film in select sequences, and Edward Van Sloan's in the film even less, unfortunately. So this is a David Manners star vehicle, and he is absolutely wonderful in this film. He has it starts to approach almost a Nick Charles sort of sleuth who is outside the realms of the law, yet is able to outguess the police at every turn and be about 15 steps ahead of the cops, and thus, of course, incur the wrath of the murderer who is, as of yet, unknown. And the mystery is actually, quite well done. It has a couple nice red herrings and various characters who are set up as potential would-be suspects or fall guys. There's a pretty nice body count too, as you get in most every classic mystery. So to be honest, this is such a fun little film that I wish I had seen it sooner. I had read about it, and I knew it was one of the films in the public domain in terms of the sort of Lugosi vehicles and other things that were unfortunately not available in good versions. So when the official sort of restoration attempt was made with the Library of Congress by Kino Lorber on their Blu-ray release, I put it on my wish list, and so now I'm just finally getting around to it. But again, this is a really remarkable film for that sort of time capsule of a smaller studio at that time in the PreCode era. You have the 3 Dracula leads, so that gets the horror fans' appetites whetted. But again, this is a straight-ahead murder mystery with the nice sort of filmmaking background for those who like movies about the making of movies. You get that wonderful time capsule flavor because they literally shot it inside the studio itself. And it's got a nice energy and pace to it, and it has a real degree of wit. And again, I think this is the David Manners performance. So if you're as big of a fan of his as I am from the Universal horror films and other things that he pops up in, this is his standout performance. It is his movie. He takes the whole thing over, and he's an absolute delight. So you basically just imagine an entire film of David Manners trading witty barbs and outsmarting police and hunting for a murderer on sound stages, and Lugosi pops up every once in a while, and Edward Van Sloan's in there for a few minutes here and there, and that's basically the joys of the Death Kiss. What's also notable about this film is it has a few short sequences of actual color tinting to certain scenes. So there's a really nice bit where, of course, they go to view the footage of the opening murder scene, because of course it was actually caught on film, and they go into the actual projection room where the studio heads would go to preview things and run dailies. And of course, for some strange reason, when the film starts, right when it gets to the climactic bit that was captured by the camera, the film catches fire somehow, and then you literally see the film start to burn, and you get this nice yellow tinting to suggest fire. There's a couple other spots where you have something similar also in the climax. So that's another interesting little note that makes this film stand out a little bit. Color tinting was done, of course, in a variety of different ways, and in the early days of talkies in the PreCode era, you did have some films still play around with using that as a sort of means of setting themselves apart, or done for premiere engagements in New York or Los Angeles. Even some of the Universal horrors in the early days, like Dracula and Frankenstein, did play around with having tinted prints made as if it was a silent film. So this is an example of where you get a little degree of that, and that's something that is missing, of course, from the absolute majority of all the crappy public domain transfers or YouTube uploads that you'll find of this film. So that's another reason why this disc release is really important, because it is, as far as I can tell, the best version of the film that's existed ever on home video. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean it's without its share of problems, of which it has a great deal. So I want to stress, do understand that going in. This is not a pristine frame-by-frame restoration from original elements. This is more of a preservation, because this film is in really rough shape, and this is the slightly cleaned up version, again with the cooperation of the Library of Congress. So also with this film being in the public domain, it's going to be much more iffy in terms of finding good elements, and also finding someone who wants to put a decent enough budget into fully restoring this film, because it's not going to be something that somebody's going to want to plunk down the money to do a 4K restoration on, although that would be beautiful, because this is such a fun little film that just does not get discussed practically ever, and gets frequently mislabeled as another horror film as a Lugosi vehicle. But again, it's it's really David Manners' film. Again, if you are a David Manners fan, and you really should because he's wonderful, this is the film for you. This is the film that I always wished existed because I loved him in other films, but you could always get the sense of, wouldn't it be nice if he was getting to play something other than the juvenile lead who's a bit ineffectual. So you see him in films like A Mystery of Edwin Drood, where he seems to sort of shake off those trappings a little bit. He has a better sort of character in The Mummy, which is sort of like a great version 2.0 redux of the same character from Dracula, because Universal's The Mummy is very much a semi-remake of their Dracula in terms of the story structure and some of the characters. But this is the David Manners performance to measure all others by. It is his film entirely, and he is an absolute joy. And for that alone, I wholeheartedly recommend this film. It is so much fun for all the elements I've mentioned, and you get a nice dose of some PreCode fun. So there is some sort of risque qualities to the dialogue and some of the scenarios and some of the murders that occur. So that you get not quite a grisly quality, but there is a little bit of PreCode fun poking in here and there. Had this been made a couple years down the road, it would not have been as obviously dark and nuanced and fun. You wouldn't have references to adultery and drinking and all kinds of the fun PreCode stuff that you do get here. So I do think it is a remarkable bit of fun. I wished I had seen it sooner. I really do. So for fans of films about films, films set in studios, fans of Universal Horror, fans of Lugosi, fans of David Manners, fans of PreCode murder mysteries, this is so much fun. It ticks the boxes for most everyone, and it has such a charm to it, and it moves at such a quick pace, and it's also got a relatively short runtime. It does not overstay its welcome, and I look forward to returning to this film many times. Now, as I alluded to, this film is by no means a fully restored title. This is more of a preservation effort. So to talk about the picture and overall quality of this master, again, this was done in cooperation with the Library of Congress from 35mm sources. I assume the original negative is long gone, since this was produced by a production company that shortly thereafter went out of business. The condition of the elements are okay to pretty good at quite for most of what's presented here, but there are definite sections where the damage is extreme, and so you are going to see everything from hairs to frame wobble to some tears, some staining, some fluctuation. Pretty much everything that you can see in an element is going to pop up here, unfortunately. So again, do be forewarned. Don't go into this thinking this is going to be a beautiful, pristine-looking Blu-ray. It's simply not. This is more of a preservation, and it is not a full-fledged restoration. They have done some restoration work, obviously, because had they just done the transfer straight, it would have been even worse. There are some sections where there is actual moving of the image, in terms of there is some cropping and some slight adjusting of the image, because there are visible bits of black area, or sort of black bars that come around on the side or the bottom, sometimes the top. I don't know if that was simply to mask damage, or the film hadn't been printed right when the elements they were having to use were made. You'll see, again, tons of dust, scratches, debris, specks, everything galore. There are also some sections of the film, unfortunately, that are from a lesser quality source that I had to switch to. The biggest chunk happens for about 10 minutes or so, and I don't know if it's 16mm, but it is so much softer that it might be patched in with some 16mm sources, but it is obviously an inferior source. It's still watchable, and they have integrated it into the transfer properly, but do keep in mind that and a few other spots will switch to a much degraded lesser source. On the audio side of things, the audio track is also extraordinarily compromised. It is, like the picture transfer, relatively clear for most of the film's runtime, just like the picture is. So for the most part, this transfer is still watchable, but the audio does frequently have, it has a quite loud noise floor. It does get even hissier at places and times. There are pops and ticks all throughout the audio simply due to the source they were working with. There's also a couple spots, particularly, again, in those sections of degraded footage. There are sections where the audio does develop a whirring and a bit of a whine here and there, and it does, unfortunately, remain relatively constant for those particular scenes. It's all understandable in terms of the elements that are available and what they're working from. So basically, this is very much the same sort of experience you'd get if you ran, if this was an actual print that was run in a theater and you were watching this and they had sort of cobbled together a best available print of the best available materials. And so they had spliced in those sections that were missing or too damaged from a lesser source to recomplete the film again. That's the sort of experience you get with this disc. It's unfortunate that I guess this is the best that can be done with the elements that are available, but it is, a lightning leap forward over all the crappy public domain editions. Plus, as I alluded to, this does restore the hand-tinted sequences for those particular moments where you have yellow and orange specifically tinted on in that projection room sequence, the climax, and one or two other spots, which again is pretty much not available on any other version that I'm aware of, unless there's some random public domain cheapy copy that just happens to somehow have them. So this is a very, very compromised presentation simply due to the elements available. The other thing that I should note is there are some bits of where the audio actually drops out, and there are some lines of dialogue that are unfortunately obscured or cut almost in half. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen enough that you will notice it, and that is unfortunately baked into the available sources. I should also stress that the audio quality is variable, so while it can sound really good, it will also go down when they go to the secondary degraded footage. It also sounds canned in places, it sounds tinny in places, some places it has the whirring, some places it has that whine in the background, and sometimes it kind of has all of those, along with the hiss and there's quite a bit of crackle in places and the noise floor, and just do go in understanding that this is basically doing the best that they can do with the best available elements, as far as I'm aware. And with this film being in the public domain and it obviously not being in the best condition for any elements, this is probably the best that can be done for the time being. And I did do some comparisons to other versions floating around, and they are all much worse. So it's bad off, unfortunately, but to compare this to the other versions floating around that you can watch for free and stuff, I mean, those are unbelievably dire. So at least some efforts have been made here to try and make this as good as humanly possible. But I just wanted to stress that this transfer does have an enormous amount of baked-in issues that are unfortunately inherent to the sources that have survived. However, the reconstruction is really well done. They have done the best with what they have available, and you also have the addition of reinstating the color tinting to the specific sequences. It's not a whole lot, but it's nice to see there, and you always do want to see the film as originally intended and released. So here is the artwork Kino came up with. This is in the sort of white banner style release they were doing with their Library of Congress restorations and silent films for a time. So it has the white spine as well. The disc label is very simple. It's just like a lot of their silent releases and other films in this sort of realm. These archival restoration titles, just with simple plain labels. Then the back, of course, also has the white background with the text layout. this does actually, it credits the restored color tinting and that it's the new HD master. But the lone extra, and what really makes this disc even better, is this has a full audio commentary by Richard Harland Smith, who talks at length about the film's production, the production company, the Tiffany Studios, the three leads coming from Dracula, its status as a PreCode murder mystery. He basically has dug up every scrap of available material in his research, trying to find every bit of information that he can recount about this film, its production, the company who made it, and unfortunately there's not a whole lot there, but it's another of his really excellent must-listen commentary tracks that help to make this, in spite of the damaged elements really holding back the presentation, the addition of his commentary really make this the only good release of this film there is, and it makes it much more enticing because you can enjoy the film in spite of the damaged elements, and you get the restoration of the color tinting, and you get Smith's wonderful commentary. He's done a number of tracks for Kino discs and other releases from other labels, and I always really enjoy his tracks. So if I see his name doing a commentary somewhere, I'm like, okay, that's extra incentive. So that's why I finally picked this up, because I'd been meaning to, and I also wanted to listen to his commentary track, which was just as good as I thought it was going to be. So those are my thoughts on the Kino Lorber release of the 1932 murder mystery PreCode thriller The Death Kiss, which is far better than what you might think it would be, being a now public domain, very compromised in terms of available elements release, and something that's not really talked about outside of the fact that it's included in so many Bela Lugosi collections of public domain titles that most people might see this going in thinking it's a horror film and come out disappointed that it's not a horror film. And with the three Dracula leads, the two of them are barely in the film, and it's more of a David Manners vehicle. But without that inadvertent misselling of this picture, it's so much fun, and it was a delight to see this. And I've always been such a big fan of David Manners, and to see him basically get his own star vehicle, along with the time capsule aspect of seeing a real studio and with real sound stages, with a fun sort of PreCode murder mystery going on, and David Manners making constant wisecracks, and it was too delicious for words. So if any of those elements, and also with appearances by Bela Lugosi and Edward Van Sloan, if any of that tickles your fancy, you will have an absolute ball with this. So I highly recommend this release, with the caveat that unfortunately the available elements have severely limited its presentation. So don't go into this expecting pristine quality, because if you do, you will be sorely disappointed. This film is still in need of greater restoration work, but that will require a great budget and somehow finding even better elements to work from. So while there is still significant room for improvement, this is the best that you can do at this point, and they did go the extra mile to fully incorporate all of the various bits from other sources, try to make the most complete presentation of the film possible, and restore those short sequences of color tinting. And this film was actually the first film directed by Edward Merrin, who went on to direct quite a number of rather solid and interesting various studio programmers and other films. He did, for example, the rather solid and interesting RKO B noirs that George Raft did in the 1940s, like Johnny Angel and Nocturne, for example. And then he also did one of my favorite Universal horror sequels. He directed Invisible Agent, where the descendant of the Invisible Man, of course, goes behind enemy lines and World War II. And it's a bit of a action adventure comedy hybrid if you haven't seen it, but it's rather well put together and one of the better of the 1940s Universal horror sequels. So realizing that this was the same person and this was the first film he directed, it's actually quite well done, particularly for the time in which it was made, the low budget, the short shooting schedule, and the fact that it was made for a company that went out of business shortly thereafter. It couldn't have been the easiest thing in the world to pull off, but this film is really well executed, and again, it never overstays its welcome. So I highly recommend this. It is a absolute blast, and the Kino Lorber edition is the is really the only option you have nowadays for a proper release that doesn't look and sound like utter crap. It is still very. If you have issues watching discs or transfers that have a lot of damage and things, then this may not be for you because it has severe damage baked into the sources. But considering what probably survives and that these are the best sources around, and the Library of Congress worked on this, and this was the best they could do, that starts to tell you that unfortunately this film is not in very good shape, and its preservation history is probably pretty dire. So this is probably the best that it's ever going to be. So I do recommend picking up this Kino release. Plus, it has the really wonderful Richard Harland Smith commentary, which is just as great as his other tracks I've heard. So those are my thoughts on the release of The Death Kiss. If you've seen this film before, I would love to hear your thoughts on it. It is an absolute joy. So I cannot recommend it highly enough. And I also want to stress, as I always do in these videos, keep supporting both boutique labels and studio labels and film restoration by buying films on disc to help keep physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.